On behalf of Platypus, New York, I'd like to welcome you to our event, The Future of the Status Quo, the Left After the Election. My name is Tana Forrester. I'm going to be moderating the event tonight. I'm a member of Platypus, New York. Platypus is an organization focused on clarifying and disentangling positions on the left. We host fora like this one, reading groups, coffee breaks, and we also publish the Platypus Review, which you can see over there. You can pick it up here. It's free. You can pick it up at various coffee shops, universities. We focus on a critique of the old, new, and post-political left. If this sounds like something that you would be interested in getting involved with, you can speak to me after the panel, or Chris, or Brian, right there in the back. Today, our panelists are going to be answering a series of questions. Hopefully their remarks will center around these questions. So I'm going to read them. So now that the Democrats have won the election, what is different from 4 years ago, when Obama's election seemed to be a departure from 8 years under Bush? Did the last 4 years signal progress or regress for the left? How will the terrain shift for the left with another term under this president? In terms of foreign policy, will there be an end to the wars, or will U.S. militarism continue unabated? Domestically, will government social programs and infrastructure deteriorate ever further, or will legislative reforms revitalize and dismantle the welfare state? Should we take for granted the idea that keeping Romney out of office promises a better environment to organize the left? And finally, what does the future hold for a left caught in the stale air of the status quo? So each panelist gets about 12 minutes to answer these questions. If they leave something unanswered, or there's anything that you all want to push them on during the Q&A, you're more than welcome. After their initial remarks, they're going to have some time to respond to each other, about 2 minutes, and then we're going to open it up to the audience. So, go ahead.
Okay, great. My name is Ben Campbell. I'm some guy who blogs at North Star, which is a website for left debates, unity, and convergence. NorthStar.info, which is by far the most proletarian of the top local domains. Okay, so to start, I'd like to center my remarks around two aspects of this panel. The first is that it has been organized by the Platypus Affiliate Society, who I thank for organizing this and inviting me, and whose slogan includes the claim that the left is dead. Now, I've been told that this slogan annoys or provokes some on the left, likely because it is self-evidently true, or at least it was self-evidently true. In order to compare the left to that 4 years ago, it's useful to quote Chris Patron of Platypus on this panel in 2008. We need to admit that today there is no left. We need to consider and explore the conditions of possibility for a left coming into existence at all at some time in the foreseeable future, which will perhaps occur under Obama, but maybe not. Now, if we take this as an accurate portrayal of 2008, and I see no reason not to, then we must note that the last 4 years have given rise to something that appears to be a development left. From Spain to Greece, the student movements of Quebec to Chile, and the Occupy movement, there has been a greater upsurge of leftism in the last couple of years than at any previous point in the neoliberal era. So perhaps it's actually more accurate to say that to periodize the neoliberal era of the 35 years before the economic crisis as the era in which the left was dead, and the post-2008 upsurge of activity represents a new era in which the left appears to be coming into existence in some form. The left can no longer be said to be dead, but nor can it be said to yet be a living vital force. Rather, it is in an early stage of development, and as development is a time of sensitivity to initial conditions, so the present moment is one in which our actions, or lack thereof, could and will play a determining role whether this nascent left develops into a powerful force or whether it arrives stillborn. The second feature of this panel that I'd like to draw attention to is that it's taking place at New York University roughly 4 or 5 years into an historic economic crisis. For it was here at NYU 4 or 5 years into the last crisis of this magnitude that arguably the first important theoretical contribution to American Marxism was published. Towards an Understanding of Karl Marx, the young Sidney Hook explored the disintegration of the left at an earlier historical juncture in his own attempts to forge an independent socialist movement in America. Hook recounts the disintegration of Marxism after Marx into an ineffectual orthodoxy, a revisionism, and an emotive but blind syndicalism. Hook contrasted these ineffectual forms with the towering figures of Lenin and Luxemburg, who offered a dialectical synthesis of the fraying strands. Despite the fact that this previous generation all failed in their project, or perhaps because of it, today's left faces a similar deterioration and a similar need for a dialectical synthesis to revitalize as a force for understanding and hence changing the world today. Indeed, our need is even greater, as the vestigial elements of the present left are not worthy of comparison to those of this earlier generation, yet alone Lenin or Luxemburg. So echoing Sidney Hook, I'll categorize three elements of the present left. The first element of this degeneration is Leninism itself, or Marxism-Leninism. We must use quotations around these terms to indicate the lack of resemblance of these elements of the present left to the historical Marx and the historical Lenin. These leftists, generally grouped into micro-parties, turn to an orthodoxy of Marxism, Leninism, or other isms for trans-historical truths, thus providing a powerful or perhaps not so powerful denial of the left's inability to grasp the present state of the world and its position in it. I don't want to spend too much time on these various Marxisms. The failure of these various orthodoxies has been proven empirically by their decades of dwindling numbers and their inability to revitalize their projects despite the material conditions of the present crisis, the crisis they've been waiting for 70 years. The second element of this degeneration is the social democratic project, which represents a compromise with the interests of capital, both practically but perhaps more importantly, ideologically. Social democrats may retain certain utopian aspirations, indeed that is the only thing that still marks them as leftists, but radical change is relegated to a distant future or Star Trek-like fantasies, and in practice their politics reduced to left liberalism. These leftists are at least to be commended for not pretending that the present left presents any serious alternative, and under certain conditions such capitalist realism is eminently practical, as social democrats have historically extracted concessions from capital when the left could not reasonably hope for more. Yet the crisis of 2008 represented a phased transition in economic and hence political reality, and as the inflated asset bubbles burst, so too did social democracy go in an instant from being reasonable to incoherent, and from being a progressive force to mere apologism for the status quo, presently serving to de-radicalize the growing numbers of discontented by maintaining certain illusions about the present. Without the same level of surplus to redistribute to the masses, social democrats have been either unwilling or unable to reorient their politics into a more direct confrontation with capital, from redistributing surplus to expropriating capital. Thus, they can often be found denying the severity of the current crisis of capitalism, suggesting that perhaps it's not all that bad, that capitalism can still afford its meager welfare states, and that piling amounts of debt and deficits are simply right-wing scare tactics. Thus, their politics have presently reduced to an atavistic utopianism of mere resistance to economic reality, useful to a leftist project, but indistinguishable from the more numerous liberal and progressive organizations that do the same without reducing Marx to what Sidney Hook called a liberal policy of social reform. Continuing now, the third element of this splintering is the reemergence of a specific form of anarchism, that which David Graeber called the new anarchism, and which others have accordingly called Graeberism. This form of anarchism, having developed during the neoliberal end of history, is similar to social democracy in offering only a politics of resistance with lip service to a utopian horizon but no clear sense of how to actually crack capitalism. It is characterized by an increased emphasis on individual subjectivity and a consequent reification of participatory processes and action, like the syndicalists spoken of by Hook. It is because of this emphasis on subjectivity and action that the anarchists have been the most inspired political actors on the left in our post-2008 time of political indeterminism. They served as the architects and catalysts for the Occupy movement, the largest resurgence in left-ish activism in several decades, which likely would not have started without their impetus. But at the same time, the very forms of anarchism that gave rise to Occupy limited and choked its growth. The commitment to changing the world through direct action led to the channeling of all energies into concrete actions, ultimately leading to ineffectual utopian schemes and the blurring of the line between liberal charity and radical politics. Since we have been asked to speak about the election, the failure of all three of these elements can be seen in their electoral strategies. Social democrats, for the most part, continue in their apologism for the lesser evil party of capital, suggesting that just as capitalism can presently be reformed, so too can the Democratic Party. Anarchists, for the most part, are straightforwardly abstain from electoral politics, while today's so-called Marxists and Leninists are not technically abstentionists, as Marx and Lenin were not, but for the most part they apply such stringent revolutionary litmus tests that in practice amount to an abstention from reality. The failure of all three of these elements can also be seen in Occupy and its subsequent disintegration. The anarchist ideology that catalyzed the movement ultimately stifled its growth, while the vast majority of Marxists either criticized Occupy from afar, attempted to use it as recruiting grounds for their own moribund efforts, or worked to redirect all energies into organized labor in keeping with their dogma. Meanwhile, social democrats saw in Occupy an opportunity to press their demands for a new New Deal, drafting a 99% platform for democratic electoral politics, exposing their lack of any vision different than, say, MoveOn.org and Jones's 99% Spring. Now, my remarks may seem critical, indeed they are, but I speak of the need for a dialectical synthesis, not as a Marxian rhetorical flourish, but as a recognition that each of these strands has something to offer, reflects some truth, and ultimately reflects the failings of the others. Present anarchists are to be commended for their emphasis on their subjectivity as actors and for their participatory inclusiveness. Social democrats wisely ground their politics in the world as it is, not as it should be, even if they fail to transcend that present. As for Marxists, they tend to be correct about most things theoretical, except for when it involves their own actions. Nevertheless, these three inadequate strategies for the present represent ghosts from the past and the tradition of the dead generations weighs like a nightmare on the brains of the living. So what would a synthesis look like, a left politics grounded in present reality? What the present moment calls for and what the present moment can indeed provide, if we act, is a mass movement diametrically opposed to the interests of capital, even if initially more anti-corporate than explicitly anti-capitalist. A movement building on the energy of Occupy, but a political movement rather than a prefigurative movement. Thus, perhaps the only question we should ask ourselves about our present actions and organizations is, do they help to create a class-based mass movement in the present, or do they hinder that goal? My introduction to left politics and de-radicalization was via Occupy Wall Street, so I'll end with a short reflection on that. Rarely before have so many shown up completely disillusioned by the ideology of capital in search of a direction, in search of an understanding of the world, and indeed in search of the left. But it was demonstrated quite clearly, at least to me, that no left exists. It is the task at present to create a left worthy of the name. Thus, the events of the last 2 years must be seen as signaling both the complete irrelevance of the existing left, as well as the possibility and necessity of its own regrowth.
My name is Bhaskar Sankara. I'm the founding editor of Jacobin Magazine. We're a print quarterly, but we actually release 3 times a year. The quarterly part is just to cut down on sort of like skip production schedule. We have no plan to ever release 4 times a year, but it saves us money and we get to still charge as much as the quarterlies. But you should still subscribe anyway, because we're in color and we're great. But to begin, and I just want to thank Platypus and everyone for coming out. The question was framed around optimism or pessimism about the present. And between those two choices, I would say I'm very optimistic about the future. And that's not my natural disposition. I'm normally not an especially optimistic person. I eat plain oatmeal every morning. I watch the military channel, unusual for a leftist. I also listen to lots of Joy Division, all very dour stuff. But I'm nevertheless very giddy. But saying that I'm giddy about the left and the chances of it being relevant doesn't mean that everything in the next couple of years will be good or that we'll see some sort of immediate resurgence. It just means that I see signs of an uneven and fledgling, but still a real left-wing intellectual and political revival, and also the possibility of objective conditions that could favor radical organizing over the next decade or two. And there is no doubt that the last 4 years have signaled progress for the left. I don't think that's debatable, and I don't think any of the panelists would disagree with me on that. Occupy, of course, was flawed in many ways, but it was also significant and relatively unprecedented. It was the first movement in decades to introduce an ideological politics grounded explicitly in class into mainstream political discourse, and that in itself is progress. labor upsurges in Wisconsin, Ohio, and the recent victory by the CTU in Chicago were defensive struggles waged against austerity, but they were also blatant reminders that class struggle still exists and is still alive in the memory and the actions of American workers. And that itself is also progress. And historically, it hasn't been the depths of recession, but rather recovery that has encouraged industrial action and encouraged workers to finally look for redress. So there's hope in the short term as well on that front, even though we should acknowledge that the structures that facilitated these actions and these struggles in the past are largely shattered. Now, as far as President Obama, I'm sure everyone here is in agreement that he's a neoliberal president waging imperialist wars overseas and wedded to domestic austerity at home. He's not a tepid ally. He's not a reluctant friend waiting for his opportunity to help. He's an overt enemy to progress and an enemy to the working class. And domestically, what we'll see in the next month and what we're already seeing is a fiscal cliff debate that plays in the hands of the right. With Occupy, we briefly changed the discussion from austerity to inequality, from our national deficit to our personal debt, and that itself was an accomplishment, but it seems to have been a fleeting one. The mainstream Democrats and mainstream Republicans will seek triangulated compromise on the deficit, and there may be some resistance from the Congressional Progressive Caucus, but like they did in the 90s, they'll probably cave. And there might also be resistance to compromise on the right by the Tea Party caucus, but they might just be pushed into irrelevance. And as Peter Frase, Jackman editor Peter Frase has argued, that might mean that that realignment of some type is on the horizon. I'm not so sure, but I'm willing to believe that's a political possibility. But simply, there aren't political forces yet assembled to do anything but prevent the very, very worst from coming to pass. The organizers of this panel did, in the prompt, ask whether we should take for granted that keeping Romney out of office promises a better environment for the left. And I would say on that front that, obviously you can't take anything for granted, but given the choice between the two, the answer is yes. It's clear and obvious that last month's result was better than the alternative. There's a theory, and Michael Harrington called it the vulture theory of socialism. Other people have different names for it. But the general sentiment is the worse that things get, the more radical people get, and that, I think, is just empirically not true. Small victories inspire people. Like the welfare state ended up against the exploitation of both Leninists and capitalists, making workers more bold and militant in their wage demands, not less. And we can also think about the anti-war movement, which reached probably its peak in 2003, 2004, and compared to the Occupy moment. And it's a clear example that extra-parliamentary movements under the right Republicans and the right, when they're in power, become warped into the movements that basically just push for the election of Democrats. But when the center-left, or if we're going to define Obama as center-left, so the left wing of the American political mainstream, which is not a very good mainstream and is tilted far, far, far to the right. But when they're in power and they're still pushing austerity and imperialist war overseas, when outside movements emerge to combat them, it becomes a far more dangerous thing, because if the alternative isn't to elect a Democrat, then people look and search for new alternatives. And out of disillusionment, there's a possibility for something more progressive. We saw it in the New Left under Johnson, who might have arguably been one of the most social democratic American presidents in the 20th century. And we saw it to a degree under Obama. So 2011 was more significant and more dangerous to capital than 2003. But there is a quote from Perry Anderson, I think, in his review of Age of Extremes that I think is also worth repeating. And he says that accurate intelligence of the enemy is worth more than bulletins to boast doubtful morale. A resistance that dispenses with consolation is always stronger than one which relies on them. So I'll end with some depressing caveats. This is the spirit that I get from watching lots and lots of Military Channel. And the actually constituted left, I think it's safe to acknowledge, is not up to its historical mission, or what has historically been conceived of its mission. And I wouldn't trust the left as it exists now to run a bloc, much less with the future of human civilization. And we compare this left weakness with capitalist strength and the complex nature of both our political moment and what would be required for substantive political change. I do temper my excitement for little acts of resistance and the somewhat renewed interest in Marxist ideas by talking to my friends and family, or more commonly arguing with my friends and family. It's always a great reminder that the individualization of success and failure and uniquely American perceptions of failure and success and luck and so on really changes how people view hardship, and the hardship that they face in this recession, and the hardship that they'll face as austerity looms in the coming years. And it will take coherent and visible left action and popular articulations and also class organization to push for reforms today and to lead the way to greater socialist transformation in the future. And none of this is predetermined. The stakes are high, and victory seems very, very unlikely, but I'm still optimistic because the forces that have emerged in the last 4 years and the intellectual currents that are emerging would seem to signal that at least the left stands a better chance now than we thought we would stand this time in 2008.
Hi, good evening, everybody. My name is Chris Maizano. I'm a contributing editor of Jacobin Magazine. I'm the chair of the New York City Local of Democratic Socialists of America, and I'm on the staff of District Council 37, which is the main municipal employees union here in New York City. Thank you to Platypus and to everyone else on the panel, and to all of you for coming today. It's somewhat surreal to think back to the giddiness that liberals and many leftists felt in the days after President Obama won election to the White House back in 2008. As the global economy teetered on the edge of collapse, there was lots of loose talk of a New Deal. You may remember that now infamous Time magazine cover that depicted Obama in the style of FDR, riding in the back of his inaugural car, head cocked confidently back, cigarette holder dangling from his smiling lips. When the president-elect voiced tentative support for the strike at Republic Windows and Doors in Chicago, liberals and labor activists were positively ecstatic. To hear some of them tell it, this was our generation's version of the Flint sit-down strike. The prominent liberal historian Sean Wilentz had just published a new book called The Age of Reagan, and the subtitle, 1974 to 2008, captured the heady mood. It seemed to many people, including many of those who should have known better, that the neoliberal era had finally come to an end. But the depth and scope of the Great Recession mercilessly exposed the profound weaknesses of the labor movement and the left, and I continue to group those two forces together because I remain convinced that their fortunes are fundamentally intertwined. And I also draw my paycheck from the labor movement as well, so I'm a little biased personally. The biggest economic crisis since the Great Depression should have been a prime opportunity for labor and the left to go on the offensive and make real gains at the expense of capital. Instead, it showed just how much 30 years of neoliberalism had undermined our capacities to even wage defensive struggles against austerity and the attack on workers' rights. Notwithstanding recent victories in state-level referendum campaigns, the anti-labor right has rung up an impressive string of victories against public sector unions, raising the terrifying prospect of a United States without any meaningful left or labor movement to speak of. So why is it that, like my friend Bhaskar, I'm more optimistic about the future of the left than I have been at any other time in my admittedly brief lifetime? The re-election of Barack Obama should not be interpreted as anything more than a victory for the left wing of neoliberalism. I have no time for claims that his re-election will free him up for a lurch to the left, the genuine left, nor do I put any stock in the notion that the growing weight of the Latino vote portends a permanent Democratic or liberal majority in the United States. These are fantasies fueled by a politics of wish fulfillment that American liberals seem to have a particular penchant for. My optimism is based instead on longer-term shifts that are beginning to come to the fore. Developments that a renewed and reorganized left here in the US might, and I stress might, be able to bend toward the cause of human emancipation. The first is the increasing awareness of class and class conflict within the population at large, a development pushed mightily along by Occupy and its discourse of the 99% versus the 1%. And here you'll have to forgive me for referring to a series of public opinion polls, which I do partially because of my long training in political science and partially because it's easy to refer to polls when you have to prepare a public talk on a very short time frame. The Pew Research Center conducts a regular poll that asks respondents questions about what they perceive to be the main divisions and conflicts in American society. This year's poll registered something that I'm quite sure everyone in this room knows very well. 2/3 of the public believes that there are very strong conflicts between the rich and the poor in the United States. This constituted an increase of about 20 percentage points since 2009, the low point of the recession. Revealingly, respondents ranked this class conflict ahead of conflicts between blacks and whites and between immigrants and the native-born as the most salient division in American society today. Perhaps unsurprisingly, this perception was most marked among young adults, women, Democrats, liberals, and African Americans than all of the other standard demographic and political groups. And it won't surprise anyone here that over 70% of young people ages 18 to 34 think that there is an intense conflict between the classes, one that is being waged from above, and is narrowing our chances of ever leading a decent and secure life. These sorts of shifts have also been registered in other polls measuring responses to a range of economic and ideological categories. Just last week, Gallup released the results of a survey that a majority of self-identified Democrats, 53% of them, and liberals, 62% of them, respond positively to the word socialism, while 75% of both of them respond positively to the floating signifier, federal government. Now, nobody should be tempted to draw any grand political conclusions from these polls. Both of them reveal profound ambivalences about the wealthy and about redistributive policies, as well as the continuing resonance of hoary ideological categories like small business, entrepreneurs, and free enterprise, all of which elicit very positive reactions across the board. But they do offer some evidence that despite our ongoing weaknesses, there is a real opening for class politics among the groups that constitute the potential base of a revitalized socialist project. The second development flows from this heightened sense of class conflict, and it's probably been all over your Facebook walls and your Twitter feeds over the past couple of weeks. And I'm talking here about the stirrings of militancy within America's burgeoning low-wage workforce. I'm talking here about the strikes at Walmart, both in their stores and in their supply chains. I'm talking about the strikes that happened among fast food workers last week here in New York City, as well as, I don't know if anyone here is also coming from this event, but I was just up in Midtown at a very big rallying demonstration by a number of labor groups and community organizations supporting the campaigns of low-wage workers at airports, in fast food restaurants, in home health care, and a range of other very low-wage industries here in the city. I think these are all very, very heartening developments. And I think, strike waves and movements like this kind of happen unexpectedly. Once workers see some people taking action, things catch on. They want to emulate that example of success. So I would not be surprised if you see these sorts of things spreading and gaining momentum in the near future. I want to end my remarks here by tempering my optimism just a little bit. None of the hopeful developments I've discussed here necessarily portend any kind of political outcome. They only indicate the vague outlines of a possible future. When he's not recording horrible rap albums, Cornel West still has something useful to say from time to time. In a recent interview on Occupy Wall Street, he distinguished between social motion and social movements. It's tempting for long-suffering leftists to look at any protest, occupation, or strike as the birth of a new radical upsurge. The events of the last year have been exciting, but they will not add up to anything more unless an organized left that's independent of the Democratic Party and causing trouble both within and outside the official labor movement succeeds in creating spaces, institutions, and structures that can provide a focus for all these disparate energies and build them over time into a political force capable of winning power and changing the world. And despite the many differences that exist on this panel and in this room, I hope that's a project that most of us will devote the rest of our lives to. Thank you.
Hey, my name is Annie Day. I write for Revolution newspaper. Thank you to Platypus and you all. In a recent talk, Bob Avakian, the chairman of the Revolutionary Communist Party, said, "Let's be real here. As bad as Bush was, in many ways, Obama is worse." Why did he say this? Because not only has Obama continued and escalated the crimes of this imperialist empire, He has gotten millions and millions of supposedly progressive and even so-called radicals to go along with this, to endorse these crimes, even to cheer for these crimes, and to be completely corrupted and demobilized in the process. Think about it. Once a week, Obama wakes up and looks over kill lists, lists of human beings, their pictures, their descriptions, and he decides which of them will be assassinated. Just 5 days ago, witnessed the 300th drone strike by Obama, and this morning there was another. What do these drones look like? Picture an engineering student, not unlike many you probably walk past in the halls, incinerated, charred into an unrecognizable state, only identifiable by his identity card. Or visualize a 15-year-old celebrating the breaking of the Ramadan fast with his family when 2 drones fired their missiles at his grandfather's house. He awoke in a hospital in Peshawar with both his legs amputated and blind in one eye. He lost cousins, his grandfather, and an uncle who was wheelchair-bound. Multiply these by thousands. Thousands who have been killed in these drones and thousands more who have had their bodies and their lives ripped apart. 6 times more than under Bush. No rule of law, no due process, no assumption of innocence. In fact, official policy is that if you're a young man who's killed in one of these drone attacks, you are counted as an insurgent unless after you are dead, someone can come forward and prove your innocence. And yet people cheer for Obama, call him our president. Or what about the 2.4 million people in prison, more than half of them black or Latino? By any objective definition, this is genocide. Genocide right here in this country, under our noses, going on every day. Yet Obama does nothing other than step up the so-called war on drug policies that feed this modern-day slave ship. But not only that, the very fact that Obama, as an African American, has risen to the stature of commander-in-chief of this imperialist empire is used, both by him as well as by many others, to say to the masses of black people and other oppressed people locked at the bottom of society that you have no excuses. Look, he made it. Why can't all these other black youth? If you can't find a job, if you're brutalized by the police, if you're locked away for decades in solitary confinement, if you're caught up in some desperate hustle just trying to survive, or even some form of destructive violence trying to make something of yourself on the terms that this system has you cast in, it's your own damn fault. Look, there's a black president. You have no excuses. Look, if we had time, we could spend hours and only scratch the surface of Obama's crimes, and I do actually think you have to get into the content of this and the lived impact of this. Exonerating tortures, but torturing those like Bradley Manning who expose crimes against humanity. Waging wars on Iraq, Afghanistan, Libya. Backing Israel's genocidal assaults on Palestine. Threatening war on Iran. Deporting a record number of immigrants. Overseeing the greatest restriction in women's rights to abortion of any president ever. Permanent detention. Propping up banks while ignoring those facing foreclosure and eviction, including the very rarely talked about huge numbers of evictions of black women from housing projects. Expanding oil production, building new pipelines, and on and on. And again, getting people who ought to know better to go along with this. Is this all Obama's doing alone? No, these are the crimes of this system. And whoever sits in the White House as president presides over a political apparatus that defends and extends the system of capitalism and imperialism. A system whose very essence and ability to continue is based on unending and frankly staggering of exploitation of literally billions of people worldwide. Is this something you get to vote on? No, because elections are a vehicle of ruling class power and ruling class decision making. And they are a brilliant way that this same ruling class gets the people that they dictate over to accept and to be confined within the terms of that ruling class. Are there differences among the Democrats and Republicans? Yes, but they are differences over how to best maintain, defend, and expand that American empire. They are both ruling class parties, and they do not, they will not, and they cannot act in the interest of the masses of people here and around the world. Elections are a trap, and they are worse. They serve to legitimize this system, and they keep people thinking along the terms of this system, suffocating their dreams, narrowing their aspirations. And by participating in all this, far too many who are considered left have been defanged and demobilized, acting like a barnacle sidling up under the killing grip of one section of the bourgeoisie. They have been, yes, bamboozled, and they've been hoodwinked. And in letting themselves be played like this, they have become complicit with the crimes of this empire which rests on the oppressed people here and around the world. Well, these are not the real choices. They are deadly and suffocating choices. Nothing good for humanity is going to come unless we reject and break out of and act in opposition to these choices. Here in my hand, I have the Constitution for the new Socialist Republic in North America draft proposal from the Revolutionary Communist Party. This sets forth an inspiring vision and concrete measures for the building of a new socialist society, aiming for the final goal of a communist world. Communism, where human beings everywhere would be free of relations of exploitation and oppression and could actually be fit caretakers of the earth. Anyone who has not read this Constitution, who hasn't deeply studied and wrangled with this, really has no idea what kind of change is possible, and you all should get it from me today. But bringing this into being is not possible without a revolution. Now let me be clear what revolution means. It means the defeat and the dismantling of the existing oppressive state, and in particular, its institutions of organized violence and repression which enforce this system. Dismantling and replacing them with a new state power that can lead masses of people to transform society in every sphere as part of the world revolution. Now, in a country like the US, revolution can't get made any old time. And revolution is not made by people acting all crazy or acting out of individual frustration. There must be a revolutionary crisis, primarily brought about through the workings of the system itself, but in conjunction with the active work of revolutionaries. Because neither is revolution brought into being by waiting around for one fine day with the approach that, sure, that's needed sometime in some distant future, but ending up piddling around in the world as it is. No, revolution requires consistent work building for revolution. As the RCP has put forward, fighting the power and transforming the people for revolution, building up the strength, the organization, the revolutionary consciousness, and the kind of repolarization throughout society that will be necessary to actually fight and to win a struggle for all-out power, for a real revolution when that becomes the order of the day. The basic and beginning doctrine for how such a revolution could be fought and won is laid out in a piece called On the Possibility of Revolution. And you can learn more about the strategy for revolution by digging into Basics, a book of quotes from Bob Avakian. This is a strategy that lays out how to get from here to there, how to be working today, how to be hastening while awaiting that revolutionary situation. What I'm arguing is not just a bunch of nice ideas or rhetoric. This is possible. And emancipating revolutions have been made before. First in Russia and then in China. The masses of people rose up. They made revolution, and they made huge advances in doing so before they were turned back by the forces of the old order. Building on and learning from this, we can do it again, and even better this time. And in particular, because of Bob Avakian and the work that he's done over several decades, summing up the positive and the negative experiences of the communist revolution so far, and drawing from a broad range of human experience, there really is a viable vision and strategy for a radically new and a much better society and world. And there is the crucial leadership that is needed to carry forward the struggle toward that goal. Now, finally, I want to say that it is precisely because of who Avakian is and the breakthroughs that he made that he is such a contended question and a point of controversy. Many people, when they find out about him, deeply love who he is and what he stands for. Others, backward fools and outright counter-revolutionaries, as well as functionaries and enforcers of the present oppressive order, deeply hate him. Look, if you want to hold on to the world as it is, or at least to big parts of it, it makes sense that you would attack Avakian for being very clear and very firm about why we need to sweep aside and move beyond all this, and move forward to something far better. But if you are someone who cannot stand the world as it is, who loses sleep over what the status quo of this system means to people here and around the world, Avakian and the work that I've been citing, which has been brought forward by this party, on the foundation of his new synthesis of revolution and communism is something that you have to deeply engage. Do not find some form of settling for the world as it stands. I'll close here with a recent invitation from Avakian which speaks to this. Let's go on a crucial journey together, full of unity against oppression and lively struggle about the source of the problem and the solution. Pursue your own convictions that the outrages that move you are intolerable to their logical conclusions, and be determined not to stop until those outrages have been eliminated. And if this, as well as learning about other outrages and ideas and how all of this fits together and flows from a common source, and how it could all be ended and something much better brought into being, leads in the direction of seeing not only the need for bold and determined resistance, but also the need for revolution and ultimately communism, then don't turn away from that because it moves you beyond your comfort zone, challenges what has been your cherished belief, or because of prejudices and slanders. Instead, actively seek to learn more about this revolution and its goal of communism, and to determine whether it is in fact the necessary and possible solution, and act accordingly.
Okay, now the panelists are going to respond to each other's comments. After that, Brian's signaling that the dumplings are here. First, we're going to do this.
Can you speak up? There's music that's trying
Oh, sorry. So the dumplings are here, and the panelists are going to respond to each other.
Thank you.
Should I go first?
Yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, I had a question or two for Bhaskar and Chris. You've both spoken about or written about this lowered. Sorry, Bhaskar and Chris, you've both written about this lowered Piven strategy. Bhaskar most recently. This is something that was written about in 1966, and it's basically a radical strategy to provoke a fiscal crisis in order to, well, as Piven and Poe explained in their original article, in order to essentially force a split or a threat of a split in the Democratic Party in order to realign the Democratic Party along different class-based lines. So I guess I'm wondering how this strategy from 1966 applies to the present, given that you're talking about the golden age of capitalism versus historic crisis of capitalism. Essentially, today you actually already have a historic fiscal crisis. So why would you be attempting to create a fiscal crisis? I mean, you have your crisis, and what the result that you're getting is an austerity steamroller. So it seems to me that what you don't have today is the threat of a split from the Democratic Party. So isn't that the part of the strategy that the radicals or leftists should be working on, is creating the force of the threat of a split from the Democratic Party if you're going to hope for any hope of realignment of that party?
Yeah, I guess the way that I would answer that question is, I mean, the reason why people like myself or Bhaskar or most of the people that write for or contribute to Jacobin or in that kind of general political milieu, the reason why we kind of look to this sort of general orientation or strategy as something useful to follow is because it incorporates the idea that many people have talked about on the left over the years of the non-reformist reform. It's the idea of pursuing reforms within the framework of the current system that are achievable, that are winnable, but yet do something to shift the balance of power within the society and create the foundation for further victories. The specific idea that Cloward and Piven had back in the 60s didn't work out for any number of reasons that I guess we could go into if we really wanted to. We probably don't have time to. But I mean, that sort of gets to the basis of our politics, which is that need to, like you said, confront conditions as they actually are. Do something to raise the political, the moral, the cultural capacities of people that are involved in struggle, but lay the foundation for larger scale changes in the future, and to set off forces that may, eventually run beyond the control of the dominant classes, to put things into play, so that we might be able to kind of create new possibilities, but at the same time, starting from a position of where we're at in the world, as opposed to trying to kind of build something and hope that people will just come to it.
Right, and also, I mean, the entire piece was sort of updating this plan to the present, but basically the plan itself was just an inspiration and a hook. It's not It's very dissimilar, actually. Our plan and Howard Pittman, with the exception, and this was actually something I co-wrote with Peter Fraze for Indies Times in their October issue. And the basic argument was that certain state and local welfare burdens should be federalized, and there should be a left-wing movement pushing towards this federalization. And the argument would be that this would shift where austerity was targeted. It would shift these burdens to the federal government because the federal government can run deficits, whereas state and local governments can't. And there's a variety of reasons that we explain in the article why we thought this was more stable terrain to build social democracy in the long term in the United States. But it wasn't just building social democracy towards the end, because as Ben mentions, the welfare state collapsed. I think in many respects, for political reasons, the welfare state isn't sustainable. The class compromise on which it's based didn't last in the post-war golden age, and to some extent, that was a exception rather than the rule. But it's precisely because it's not sustainable, we think that the forces that we are constructing, or we would construct, in pursuit of this welfare state, the stronger unions, the number of strikes which increase under conditions of full employment, this would create stronger ground on which to make further reforms. Because fundamentally, there was nothing predetermined about the crisis of the 70s and how it resulted in neoliberal success. If you read, not to invoke him again, but to read the Considerations on Western Marxism, the first edition, it was written in 1974, and it's easy to sort of laugh at it because in the foreword to it, Perry Anderson sort of expresses hope that this historical moment, 1974, was the moment when he was seeing a rebirth of Trotskyism. There was strike actions at their all-time high. We had the long '68 movement in Italy. You had the peak of U.S. strike actions. Then by '76, '77, that all was over, and we really saw the Volcker shock later on. Under Reagan, the war against air traffic controllers. We saw battles over City University of New York and free tuition. We saw really the onset of the neoliberal era. But this was a political defeat because the left did not have the political forces to win out in that crisis. It doesn't mean that there was anything predetermined about it. In the same way, I think a future crisis could be resolved in the left's favor, and it just requires the organizations in place to do so.
Annie, do you have anything that you want to say?
Yeah, I mean, not to this last question, but to the people's opening remarks. Is that what we're?
Yeah, unless you want to respond to what he just said.
Well, anything.
Okay, go ahead.
I mean, look, I think the framework or the question at hand, because there's, aside from the, Barack Obama's small victory, for whom? And I think that is a question you have to ask, for whom and for what. But look, I think the question at hand is whether you're going to make your way within the world as it is, which does, look, any social democratic plan within the United States sits on literally the blood and the backs of millions of people around the world. Welfare, who makes our clothes? I just read the article about the orphanages in Haiti. Why is the Haitian, which the U.S. completely demolished this country? Jamaica, you could run it down the list. Why is America in the wealthier position it is in? Why is it the top dog monster in the world? Because it has, demolished the economies and countries all around the world and enforces that through the biggest military monster in the world. And so then to sit here and argue about this or that social democratic plan, it is like you're on a slave plantation and you're trying to figure out how you're whether the slave master is going to be this way or that way, did it make some difference for slaves at that point if they had a slave master who went and tore apart families actively, or one that sort of tried to, let their slaves read books, and which did happen? Yes, that mattered in some level and in some ways, but then to argue that you were going to keep the slave system in place but make them friendlier was clearly not the argument that people should have been having at that point. It was, how the fuck are we going to get out from under this? So I do think that is main question at hand here. Look, there's other things. I just, LBJ, and it reflects, look, LBJ, most social democratic president. What was the number of bombs dropped in Laos? Was it like 300 million? It's the kind of number that makes you want to go look it up because it's such a big fucking number. But the fact that LBJ, social democratic, for whom? Not for the people of the world, which is how we have to proceed and who we have to have in our minds first and foremost as part of figuring out the answers that are needed.
I'm sorry, do you
well, my point when I invoked LBJ was in the context of the fact that a left-wing resistance, the new left resistance to LBJ was more threatening because his domestic policies, in many ways, represented the most liberal wing of the Democratic Party at the time. And even on civil rights and other stuff, LBJ was more progressive than other parts of the Democratic Party. It's precisely for that reason when there was a strong, vibrant left-wing movement opposing him, it was more threatening. But as to, I guess, something that Annie just invoked, I think it's a lot of what she said was based on an old theory of sort of labor aristocracy that I think just is false. I think it's sort of offensive to think that workers in the U.S. are slave masters exploiting the rewards of exploiting or taking advantage of third world exploitation. I think that's false. I would go further and say that's just a mixed diagnosis of just the way capitalism operates and global developments within the last 20, 30 years. I would say that workers today, for example, in China, development has been uneven and contradictory. And there's some segments of the Chinese working class and Chinese peasantry that have benefited from development and capital investment. And to say that isn't to say that when they strike and when there's massive labor upstarts in China, and when there's a renewed left-wing movements in China, it's not to say that we're on the side of capital and not labor. We're always on the side of labor. It's to acknowledge that things are contradictory or dialectical, and that's sort of how growth has proceeded. I don't think the U.S. Workers, even when they are benefiting from buying cheap goods at Walmart that are produced very cheaply by Chinese laborers, are in some way participating in their exploitation. I think that's false.
Annie, would you like to respond, but keep it kind of short?
Yeah, I'll be quick. Just to clarify the analogy, the U.S. was the slave master. That was the analogy, and then to argue that you're going to try to improve it within the terms of what you've been presented, instead of trying to figure out how the masses of people, yes, here, but also around the world, are going to get out from under this. And then just very quickly, it is just, look, yes, you can build mass internationalism in this country, including promoting that among people here, but it's just, I don't know what, you're not looking at the actual reality to think that the people here don't live off the wealth, whether they don't choose it, they're born in this fucking country, but they do live off the wealth of the people of the world. Now, let's get out of it, all of us together.
Yeah, I guess I have one question for Ben and one question for Annie. I guess my question for Ben would be, how do you propose that we on the left politically confront or deal with the fact that the social base of the new left that all of us want to build is currently connected in a number of various different ways to the Democratic Party? And how would you go about proposing the split of those people, forces, institutions from the Democratic Party in the manner that you had talked about? And then after a few responses.
Well, I mean, I really don't think that you need to engineer a split from the Democratic Party at the moment. There's large numbers of discontented people that form the basis of Occupy, the majority of whom were probably discontented Obama voters. What they're looking for is an alternative, and what the left needs to do is to provide them that alternative, not to try to get them to go back to the Democratic Party and tell them that, in fact, the Democratic Party is salvageable. What that actually results in is basically just to either apathy, or people will turn to ultra-leftist, anarchists, etc. I mean, what needs to happen is electoral campaigns of third-party candidates, because the reality is that at present, the majority of Americans still define their politics electorally. And so you've had candidates like, for instance, Kashama Sawant in Washington a few weeks ago, about 29% as an avowedly socialist candidate. This is the kind of things that the socialist left should be engaged in. So basically, if I can just segue on that to what I wanted to follow up with the Cloward-Pippin strategy, the point that I was trying to make that I don't think I really got an answer to is that original article says that there has to be an implicit threat of a split from the Democratic Party in order for this strategy to work. And so are you advocating, either Bhaskar or Chris, a threat of a split from the Democratic Party? Because, I mean, in your magazine, when you've talked about this issue in Jacobin, what you said, I mean, it wasn't you, but it was also DSA members, I believe, Jason Schulman and Michael Hirsch, said that anything a third party can do, anything a third party should do, can also be done through Democratic primaries. And you yourself, Bhaskar, have described the Democratic Party as a party of the center with quasi-social democratic wing. So it doesn't sound like you're willing or interested in any type of a break from the Democratic Party. So I would hope that you could clarify that and explain, if you're not interested in that break, how are you going to get a realignment?
Wait, I would like Chris to respond first.
As to the question of, I mean, I just find it, I mean, as someone who, works every day in the labor movement, is involved in union politics, who is, fairly closely connected to what, actual people do on the ground every day, it would be really difficult to just declare, a third party left alternative to the party that they're part of, semi-institutionally, and tell them that this is the solution to their problems, that they should, leave this coalition that they have been part of through, say, their defensive organizations and their trade unions and such, and just leave it and risk the fact that, by doing so, they could really seriously jeopardize the things that they've won over the course of their struggles and their unions and what have you. It doesn't work. I mean, you can go to any, if you were at, Midtown today, or if you go to anyone, you go to any similar event, you always have left groups, left formations, showing up at these sorts of things, handing out their literature, beating them over the head with this sort of break with the elephant, break with the ass, build a party of the working class sort of propaganda, and it's just dismissed out of hand. It doesn't appeal to people. It doesn't appeal to their common sense, and it doesn't appeal to their experience whatsoever. I just don't think it can be done that way. I don't think that you can have the sort of, if you build it, they will come strategy that you seem to be talking about, which is sort of running campaigns, declaring parties, and then hoping that it will attract people. I just don't think it will work that way. I don't necessarily know what the answer there or the alternative to that is either, but I don't know. It just doesn't seem as like something that would be successful as sort of a general orientation or a general rule to follow. That doesn't mean I don't think that leftist progressives should run third-party campaigns locally where it makes sense. It makes sense in a lot of respects, and maybe in that race in Washington it did make sense. But I just don't think it holds as a general political principle right now.
All right, Ben, would you like to respond?
I mean, there's no such thing as general political principles. It depends upon the context. It depends upon the material conditions. And at present is one where the Democrats will be implementing severe austerity over the next couple of years. And to say that people aren't willing to break with the Democrats when they'll be implementing severe austerity at the state level and the federal level, I mean, that's just defeatism. I mean, it seems more likely to me that you could have a third-party alternative than you could actually reclaim the Democratic Party without a third-party alternative. So.
Wait 1 second. So, Annie, the question was also directed at you. Do you have anything that you'd like to
No,
say?
he said.
No, actually, I have a different question for you.
Both are worse. That's my answer.
Oh, okay.
I mean, I know what the response to that question is going to be, so
Well, that's unfair.
I mean,
Go ahead.
very clear the whole time. But I mean, this is an absolutely honest question. Like, I just want to know, what does the RCP do on a daily basis? Like, what? I'm genuinely curious. Like, what do you do to build the revolution in the United States and to rally people to that banner? I've always been kind of mystified. Now that I'm sitting on a panel next to someone from the RCP, I kind of would like to know a little bit. What do you do on a daily basis?
It's a good question, and actually there's one, we write about what the party and the movement for revolution does in Revolution newspaper week in and week out. And you should read it, and it actually talks a lot about things that are happening in the movement for revolution. Briefly, this is concentrated in that there's a statement on the strategy for revolution. There's a statement on the strategy for revolution in this book, Basics, and it does actually talk about, sort of provides the framework and lays out an ensemble of revolutionary activity. But the sort of meta, whatever, is this slogan, fight the power and transform the people for revolution. So we do a lot of work in leading people in different spheres, in the most oppressed sections in particular of society, in the ghettos and barrios all across this country, in leading people to fight, to things like there's in these neighborhoods, people's neighborhood patrols, which work with people to patrol the neighborhoods and interpose themselves when they see illegal actions happening by the police under the color of authority. That's part of a larger, connected link to a larger fight around mass incarceration and working with broad numbers of people around that. They build movements to end the degradation of women, in particular, to end pornography and patriarchy. And that takes different forms. Revolution newspaper is at the heart of this movement for revolution in terms of both giving people a sense of not just what's happening, but why. What's the hand of the system behind this, and how it can be radically different. And that Revolution newspaper, there's a lot of, yes, there's selling of it, but it's also sort of the network of people around it. There are revolution clubs, which run amok, doing all kinds of things on campuses and neighborhoods, and then in a lot of collective discussions. And then there's promoting the work of Avakian and projecting out what is, look, people, in the words, what is socialism for real? And it's not, it's not something any candidate is doing or talking about. It's actually a transition to communism. Well, what is that vision? What is the actual way the world could be? And that gets promoted in all kinds of ways. I, do a lot of work among artists and artists who are engaging Avakian's work and projecting that out in society in different ways. Look, in brief, there's a point in the statement on strategy where it talks about how we are today building up the thousands, orienting and organizing and training them to influence millions in a revolutionary direction today, who will be influencing and leading millions when conditions come into being to make revolution possible. So that gives you some sense of what this movement for revolution is doing on a day-to-day basis, and people should come into revolution books and find out if you've had that question.
Can I ask a question?
No, it's not Q&A time yet. So, do you want to respond to that?
After Bhaskar.
Just wait.
Well, actually, I just want to respond first to your questions. I think I remember them, but if I mess up anything, you can interrupt me. But I have actually never used, I don't think Jackman's ever used the word reclaim the Democratic Party. I mean, the Democratic Party itself, and I do think that this independent political action is important. The threat of a split, all that is important. I think what was very useful in the CTU struggle was the fact that we're going up against a neoliberal Chicago political machine by mobilizing communities that have traditionally been wedded to, these are people that actually ended up, I'm guessing, voting for Rahm Emanuel. Then a few months later, these communities were mobilized in defense of the teachers and against it. I think that's very useful. And I do think that that fundamentally in the long term, we would all like to see a different party than the Democratic Party. It isn't going to be the Green Party or a party like that, because I think the best way to interpret parties is on the class basis of the Green Party. I don't see a difference between the class basis of the Green Party and the Democratic Party, meaning that there's nothing structurally making the Green Party indifferent to the Democratic Party. You can look at the German Greens, you can look at a lot of these other so-called left alternatives, and once they get any semblance of popular support, they sometimes even move further to the right than the original party that they were posturing to the left of. Like the German Greens are to the right, probably of the SPD right now. So I do think that long term it is necessary to build a labor party, a workers' party in the United States, and also long term it's necessary to build a revolutionary party in the United States that could merge and influence the direction of this workers' party. And yeah, that's fundamentally what I believe. And as far as the Democratic Party being a party of the center with quasi-social democratic tendencies, it's not a party of the center in any historical sense, but I think I said that like New York Magazine. It's for their readership. It is in our current political climate, where people would interpret left and right. The Democrats are more or less in the center of what people's understandings of what that is. And there are quasi-social democratic tendencies in the Democratic Party. That's just true. The Congressional Progressive Caucus, there's dozens and dozens of representatives and a few senators that would probably be fine with the label social democrats. I don't think that's particularly good or progress or good by the standards of any other advanced capitalist country, but there are, and I'm fine with that word center in that case.
Do you want to respond? All right, so there will be a Q&A, but first there's food over there, so in like 3 minutes, we start the Q&A. Before we start our audience Q&A, there's going to be a clipboard going around if you want to receive event info or coffee break notifications. Sign up on it. Start in the back. Okay, and there's a guy in the back with his hand up.
Really, I'm sorry for being so obstructive. I haven't done this town very much.
Okay, that's fine. I understand.
It's gotta be good here.
Speak
Oh,
up.
okay, I'm gonna speak up.
Maybe stand.
Yeah, they used to,
Stand up. Could you stand up?
Yeah, I suppose I can, but then I have to shed my coat.
Oh.
No.
All right, yeah, I'll stand up. Hi, look, I have a vested interest here. I wrote an article for Bhaskar called How the Left Has Won in Jacksonville, so you know where I stand on these questions. Abstention from reality, that was one of the phrases that I wrote down. I think it was bad. But I wrote some other quotes down here too. Class-based politics, opening for class politics. Class-based politics was Bhaskar. Opening for class politics, that was Chris. But look, what is it about us on the left? Why do we think that class-based politics is the only kind of politics that works?
Sorry, speak up.
Why do we think that class-based politics are the only thing that can work for and on and with the left? It's never been true in American history. Class-based politics have never really worked, as far as I can tell. The American political system has worked to not just diffuse, but to, in an interestingly capillary way, turn the politics of class into a different kind of politics. So now I feel like I'm Kenneth Burke at the American Writers' Congress in 1935. I'm saying enough already with the workers and the proletariat. Let's start talking about the people. And I heard Andy say that. All right. If politics here have never been based on class, then what are we doing here? Why are we fetishizing class? I guess it's really the question. And I ask the question as I'm still. Why also are we conflating these levels of analysis from the social to the electoral? As if politics are mainly electoral, when in fact historical evidence suggests that cultural politics have far superseded electoral politics. Why don't we pay attention to that? Instead of dismissing electoral politics, I'm fine with that, but let's pay attention, serious attention to cultural politics. The question is, what is the questions that follow, I think, are, what is the left? The future of the status quo, the left after the elections. The actually constituted left? What does that mean? Us sectarians in this room? Or something maybe broader, deeper, more interesting, including, and I guess the more concrete question would be, and here I can't believe I'm saying this, I'm picking up on something that Andy Day said. What does the transition from capitalism to socialism actually look like? Not in theory, just leave that aside for now. Not in theory, but in history. What does it look like? And I don't mean what does it look like in 1917 or in 1949 when the communists seized power. What does it actually look like? What does it feel like? What is the transformation of social relations that create socialism as opposed to capitalism? Look at the transition from feudalism to capitalism. Did it happen overnight as a function of revolution? Actually, no. It happened over 400 years. It was an incremental, surely it was a political process during those great bourgeois revolutions. But it didn't happen overnight. It didn't happen as a function of revolutions either. It just didn't. So why can't we think about socialism in those terms? Why can't we think about the future of the left in those terms? We're here. We're getting things done. We might even be winning.
wants to start?
I will.
Go ahead.
Just first, I would say, speak for yourself when you say of the sectarians in the room, because I do actually think the idea of a
sectarian?
Huh?
You really don't think you're a sectarian?
No, and I actually think it's really the idea of the sectarian left. I think it's sort of the idea that they're all just differences of meaningless religious groupings that no one can really understand. When I actually think, look, I think it matters a great deal to debate out questions of line, which means your understanding of the situation in the world and what you're going to do about it. Basically, how you see the problem and the solution. And debating those things out, I actually think are if they're rooted in reality and trying to change reality, I think they matter a lot. So. Anyway, so that's just, I had to say that. But look, I think that first, I guess there's two parts of your question, and I will try to be brief. One, on the question, look, it's not you can't start by saying what's going to work. You actually have to start by saying what's true. And what's true is that we live in a brutally class-divided society here and all around the world. That's true, and it's historically developed. And here we are, and the proletariat looks different in this country now than it did 85 years ago. It looks very different, and I think you do have to proceed from what is the interest of the people who genuinely have nothing to lose, who would be the backbone of a revolution in a country like this. There's no such thing as the people when they are, as a whole. In the world as it stands, you actually are divided by classes as well as divisions between oppressed nationalities, the divisions between men and women, where half of humanity is demeaned and degraded throughout the whole world, the divisions between those who work with their minds in our society and those for whom the sphere of intellectual life is stolen from them largely, and they work with their backs if they can find work at all. There are brutal divisions in our society here and around the world. Now the question is, one, where do they come from? And two, can you get rid of them? And if so, how? And that leads to your second question and I think the answer is yes, you can get rid of them. They come from a system of imperialism and capitalism. They haven't always existed, and they don't have to be this way. You can make a revolution. You do have to seize power, because you cannot make changes within what is. And I think why? Because the state will stop you. And because the relations of the ways in which things get produced in the society will rebel against you if you try to make changes that don't fit with what is. That's a longer conversation we can talk about. Well, what is the material reality? I am definitely going too long. Second point quickly is in terms of, related to this, how can we get out from under this, is the question of what does socialism look like? And I'll say, people should get this constitution. It actually lays out very concretely what is the form of governance of a new state power? What are the rights and the roles of the people in the society? What about the role of an institutionalized vanguard party in this society? What about the economy and the functioning of the economy, including how it lays out very concretely the relationship between anyways, I won't go on. The economy, it talks about that. Culture, education, arts. It lays out very concretely, and what it feels like is a big fucking argument and discussion and debate about how the world can change, because there will be space for that in the context of a state power that is actually moving towards the emancipation of all of humanity, which cannot happen, cannot even be begun in the world as it is. We need a revolution. That's actually what you have to be working on today, or else the only other option is you are working within and to reinforce the world as it stands.
Well, I'll just say that briefly I agree with the beginning of Penny's statement, which is actually on the importance of debating these lines and these, I guess, what might seem on the surface as narcissistic differences with the left. So to some extent, I definitely consider myself, in many ways, in the best sense of the words, a sectarian. I'm ideological. I have what I think. I'm willing to debate and openly project what I think and speak to other people. And I think there's nothing wrong with doing that and presenting your view and letting other people present their view. And then it's really up to just other people to decide who's right or wrong. You're never really going to sway the other person with diametrically opposed views, but hopefully you could at least heighten contradictions. But I do think that class-based politics are important, and not to sound overtly orthodox, but I do think that that the worker as a category is fundamentally different than the people, and I think there's a difference between class-based politics and populist politics. I think class is at the core of our daily lived life. I think at the point of production is where workers have the most power, and I think that is a constant because of capitalism. I would agree that there are, and I was about to use the word cultural losses because I don't think that's actually true to use the word gloss. I think that's too dismissive. But there are ways in which like lived experience can't just be reduced to class. And at different historical moments, class struggle takes different forms. So I don't want to sound like I'm more orthodox than I am, but I do think fundamentally the worker's position in the production process is where it derives its strength. And briefly to touch on your last question as far as a socialist transition, I think it's important to think about. I agree that the transition from capitalism to socialism obviously would be a long and protracted one, and the feudalism comparison is sort of apt in that regard. But there is also the idea that sort of quantitative change can lead to qualitative change. Reforms as they build up, if they're, I guess Chris was invoking Andre Gore's non-reformist reform idea, that fundamentally there are certain reforms that build social power for the left and cause us to question certain given authorities and structures. And I'm not a social democrat, but we could look at plans like the Meidner Plan and other plans that came close to actually questioning at least production and ownership in a fundamental way. And I think if they had been successful, then you could actually call that society a socialist society because it's a society that doesn't have the exploitation of person by person.
Would you like to address this one?
Just very briefly, about why is the Renewed Left project have to focus on class-based politics? I think it's largely just due to the present economic reality, where you have an historic economic crisis and a massive overaccumulation of capital seeking more profitable investment opportunities, such that the real tension now is between capital and, if you want to call it the people, sure, or take like a Jody Dean approach and call the proletarian as the rest of us, that's fine, but between that form of labor and capital, it seems that the orientation of politics in the present and in the near future is going to be directly against capital.
Oh, sorry. Do you want to address this?
I mean, just really quickly, I just want to sort of, maybe I may be kind of misinterpreting what you said a little bit, Jim, in the back. But I wouldn't draw the same kind of strict distinction that you seem to between class politics and cultural politics. I think that they're very intertwined. I'm not the kind of person that would think that we should disdain cultural politics only in order to privilege some sort of very kind of monochromatic conception of class politics. I think the two are completely intertwined. I think one of the best things that's ever been written on this subject is Ellen Willis's review of Thomas Frank's book, What's the Matter with Kansas, which kind of made that argument in a really problematic way, I think. I kind of wanted to get into kind of the way, I disagree with the way that you kind of portray Gramsci in that article you wrote for Jackman, but I fear that's like a little too inside baseball right now, so maybe later on we'll talk about that, because I think it comes back to the cultural and class politics question, but whatever. So we'll just leave that for later when we're drinking beer, I guess. Yeah, it's, yeah.
Okay, I just need to have a comment. I guess I have a comment and a question for each of the panelists. I did a comment question and ask Chris is the same one. So Ben, you mentioned Sidney Cook. I was rather charmed by that reference. But I'm curious how you would interpret his later move to the right. If you see that as a personal eccentricity or see it as a deeper manifestation. But my main question, I guess, to Bhaskar is, I'm glad you admit you're a sectarian, but I don't understand why you deny that you're a social democrat. I mean, it seems to me that the politics you're pushing are classic social democracy, and that the DSA strategy has been around for years, and that whatever one can say about sectarian or ultra-left politics, it's been a manifest failure, even on its own terms. Forget about revolutionary politics, but even in terms of reformist politics. Mainstream politics have just kept on going further and further to the right. And you're basically saying the same kind of things that Michael Harrington was saying in the 70s and 80s. And things keep getting worse. And that's the predictable result of just like handing over things to the Democratic Party. Even within the Democratic Party, there's basically no left pressure on Obama. So even within the limited reformist or sub-reformist terms that are being set, I don't understand the basis for your optimism. And finally, for any day, you referred to the mass incarceration of poor, particularly Black and Hispanic youth, and you called it genocide by an objective standard. And I think there's a fundamental problem with the misuse of terms like genocide. Mass incarceration and even mass murder do not constitute genocide. If they were the case, then Stalin and Mao would, as the right wing keeps telling us, be guilty of mass genocide. And I don't think that's a proper use of the term genocide in the case of either Stalin or Mao, figures for whom I have no sympathy.
Yeah, I mean, Richard, we can talk about Sidney Hook personally. I don't think everyone's really that interested in it. But whether it's a personal failing of Sidney Hook's, I mean, certainly not. It's a symptom of the larger left failing, and specifically his own personal faith in Lenin and the Bolshevik project. And I think that if you talk specifically about his philosophy, you know, the classic Leninist response is that, you know, it was mixing pragmatism and Marxism causes the rightward shift. And I actually think there is truth to that, but not for the reason that the Leninists say. It's the fact that, you know, Sidney Hook ultimately saw too much of Marx and John Dewey rather than Dewey and Marx, such that he ultimately seemed to reify action and present Lenin as sort of the great man of history, which he eventually wrote in subsequent books in the 40s. So I think that certainly his problematic, I think that the sort of fusion of Marxism and pragmatism is promising, and there's still some potential there, but I think he went about it in a problematic manner that might have led to some of his rightward shifts.
I mean, to get to your question about being a social democrat or not, I mean, Marx and Kautsky and Lenin and all these people at one time or another referred to themselves as a social democrat when it meant something, I guess, slightly different. I would say that I don't consider myself a social democrat because social democrats are ideal as sort of a corporatist class compromise where the state, labor, and capital, they each have a share, they each have their roles to play in society. I fundamentally believe in society where there is no capital or labor. You know.
So would you consider yourself a Kautsky?
Bernsteinian? I would consider myself, yeah. I mean, these are sort of, I think these are somewhat esoteric debates, but I would consider myself closer to the Kautskian center than to the Luxemburgian left or the Bernstein right. And there's fine distinctions, and I've thought way too long about them, and it's impacted by my social life significantly. But yeah, I would consider myself closer to the Kautskian center with many caveats. That being said, I think that I'm a DSA member. I don't tremendously. I'm not an active member. I don't pay dues. But I guess, but I do. I mean, I identify as a member. I would say there's lots of fine distinctions within the DSA tradition, like any other. You might just call it narcissism the small differences, but I think that the politics espoused by myself or Chris or Peter is significantly different than the politics that were espoused by Harrington, and there again, like might be fine distinctions, but in general, I think the failure of politics, both revolutionary and reformist in the U.S., has to be put in the context of the left has been failing everywhere. So it's not just the DSA failing in the U.S., it's far larger and stronger parties, Mitterrand in France, and further left parties failing around the world since the 70s. And I think you just have to put that in a wider historical context.
I actually looked up, because someone just said to me, I looked up not that I hold the UN in high regard, but I looked up their definition of genocide, and it's worth doing. Carl Dix, who's a spokesperson for the Revolutionary Communist Party and doing a lot of work against mass incarceration, has made the point that what we're seeing is a slow genocide that could at any point turn into a fast genocide unless we act. And he did a speech, silence plus mass incarceration equals genocide. Look, what are we talking about? We're talking about a whole people, a nation of people whose oppression is built into the very fabric and DNA of America since its beginning, who have been exploited through slavery, through slavery in new forms, through convict labor and more, after slavery was formally abolished, through Jim Crow, the forcible, sort of the push and then the pull up north and the exploitation through Jim Crow and the factories, and now a situation where a whole section of, in particular, black masses of people are no longer profitably exploitable. 2.4 million people in prison. I mean, it is stunning, half of them black or Latino. You look at both and then what does that mean? It means you have a whole section of people who are permanently forced into a criminal, Michelle Alexander writes about this, in every regard, in their home, in their housing, in their employment, their inability to vote, who have been robbed of their basic ability to function in society, who've been robbed of their future. Look, we do a lot of work in these neighborhoods, and when you walk through and talk with people about the epidemic of police murder, of mass incarceration, there's a woman I talked to recently who talks about how she has binoculars by her window, and every time her son goes out to the corner store, she watches to see if he gets stopped by the police, because they know if you get stopped at any point, you could be killed. And this is true for a whole section of people. Now then you look at, there's people like Pat Buchanan, who's yes a lunatic, but he's also somebody that's a spokesperson for a section of the bourgeoisie in this country, and he's argued this. Well, it's actually in this part of the logic of what got argued around the thing in the death penalty in California. This is really expensive. And what's the next logical step for a whole section of people that you have no future for, literally? So then I think just quickly on, and people should get into this. Go to revcom.us. Watch this talk by Carl Dix where he walks it through much more deeply than I'm able to here about why this is actual genocide and what our responsibility is to stop this. And then quickly on Stalin and Mao, look, most people in this country, including most people who consider themselves left, just don't know anything about the history of socialism in those countries. What actually went on, what the actual advances were, and then yes, what the shortcomings were. But you have to look, and this is what Avakian has argued, you have to look at it, one, what were they trying to do, what were they up against in doing it, what were the actual advances made, and then yes, where did they fall short, including in their own conceptions. But never at any point did either Stalin or Mao make a conscious decision, either through the workings of those systems at that point or through conscious policy, that they were going to target forcibly a whole section of oppressed peoples. And actually, what both of them stood out for was the ways in which they went at the liberation of oppressed peoples in those respective countries.
Okay, I saw someone, before you I saw someone over here. Yeah, I think it was you.
Sorry. This is a question about, should I use this? This is a question about nationalism and foreign policy. While certainly my politics are considerably closer to Bhaskar and Chris than to Annie, I was chastened by the fact in Annie's presentation, one way of dividing up these presentations is not in terms of these various interpretations of left political economy, but is rather that the first three presentations are talking about what a liberal would call domestic policy, while the final presentation was largely focused on things that were going on abroad. Why is that, I think, interesting and maybe troubling is because much of the line that we've seen in recent days from Jacobin, from stuff I've written, and so I'm very complicit in this, is about bringing back the strong state. Diagnosing the neoliberal condition that afflicts both the mainstream and also that afflicted the new left. And saying we need to remember that centralization and the strong state is very important for an effective left politics. And I totally agree with that. But at the same time, as the exchange about LBJ showed, centralization of the strong state in American history, and really throughout the history of 20th century socialism, has always been a problem. And it's been a problem because of nationalism. And so I guess my question to Bhaskar and or Chris is, whatever one's story of how you move in a socialist or a social democratic direction in America, what is the international scene going to look like? Who are, a future socialist America's partners are going to be? What kind of international coalition do you see on the level of international political economy and on the level of international relations that could sustain this kind of politics? This is a very old debate. The question of the relationship between communism and nationalism has been going on since the failure of the German Revolution. And I actually don't think we have any good answers for it. And so I wondered if you could address that, strong state versus nationalism.
Lucky for you, we do. Lots of good answers. But Chris is going to give them.
Thank you. I guess on this question, this is how I would answer it at this point. Yeah, you are right. I wouldn't want to be the kind of person who goes about kind of glorifying central state power, the power of the state. Yeah, for all the numerous reasons you cite, and the failures of 20th century socialism, the fact that statification is not necessarily in any way consonant with socialism or socialization or any of those things. So that's why I kind of follow sort of the line advanced by people like, say, Leo Panitch and Tim Gindin, two very good Canadian Marxist political economists who kind of remind Marxists of the old quote from the old man himself about how you can't just kind of seize on to the machinery of state power and wield it for your own purposes because of the way that the state has historically been constructed. So if we're going to go about taking state power, which is a question not on the agenda today, we also have to deal with the question of what we do with the state, how we restructure it, how we kind of incorporate popular decision-making and decentralization within it. Because, yeah, no, you're right. A lot of the discontents that came out of the 1970s with the welfare state, kind of these sort of populist, right-wing, grassroots sort of discontents, were based in some very real and legitimate grievances with the welfare state turning people into clients and so forth in this environment. So, yeah, I agree with you. On that question, we need to do more thinking about that. On the question of foreign policy and nationalism and internationalism, I don't know. I've on this respect, I think again I would kind of refer back to kind of a hoary old quote from Marx himself from the Communist Manifesto about how we always need to settle scores with our own national bourgeoisies, and we live in kind of the belly of the beast, to use an old expression. Kind of the U.S. state is still the most powerful state in the world easily. Manages, controls, superintends the reproduction of the global capitalist system. And the greatest blow that we could strike on behalf of global solidarity, internationalism, and so on and so forth is to bring domestic reform here in the United States. I strongly believe that. And I think our role is to kind of win here, change the United States, do whatever we can to make it a more humane society, both internally and externally, and allow more room for people elsewhere to wage their own struggles where they're at.
Can I just follow up directly on that? I mean,
sure.
I just, my worry, I mean, on one hand, of course,
Hold on, wait 1 sec. How much of a
very
follow-up
quick,
is
very
this
quick.
gonna be? Okay.
It seems to be insufficiently dialectical in the sense that assumes you can solve the domestic problems without addressing, it assumes that a nationalist ideology that animates most people in America is not going to get in the way of a domestic reform agenda. And if that's not the case, then it seems like we're out of answers. Right? It assumes you can do the domestic first.
Okay, well, you go, yeah, and then you can go on.
Well, look, I am a fan of central state power, but I'm a fan of a radically different kind of central state power that is actually proceeding. And this is, again, this is something Avakian has summed up by studying in particular where Stalin especially, but also Mao, fell short. Mao was principally an internationalist, but there were still elements of nationalism in what he was arguing, and Avakian talks about this at length. But in terms of actually proceeding in a different state power with the interest and putting the interests of the world revolution first. And he has a quote, internationalism, the whole world comes first. Now you do have to make revolution country at a time. And I just will quickly, because people are using the word socialism. Socialism is three things. It's a new economic system, It's a new political structure, a new state power, and most especially it's a transition to communism. It does not mean sharing the spoils of empire among a handful of people in this country, which despite your potentially best desires is what you're arguing for when you talk about domestic reform in the world as it is and not making revolution, real revolution.
And you want to respond?
Well, yeah, just to quickly, I guess, address what I see as a little bit of actually overlap between Chris and Annie. Which is the fact that I think that it might be antiquated to just say that the struggles need to come individually country by country. Because if you actually look at Greece, the most depressing thing about Syriza is that they really, that there's really no option if they take power. They could either govern as the center left, which would mean concessions to Europe and sort of a mild form of austerity, or they could govern as the radical left, which would be an absolute, if they tried to break with global capitalism as a tiny, not very wealthy at this point nation, we would just have another Albania. And that wasn't exactly a shining example. I don't think even Annie would defend Hux's Albania, maybe. But
What's that a contest?
But okay, well, we're in agreement then. Sorry, not to be but I do think that shows the again just reinforces that failure of socialism in one country. We need to think about organizing on a continental basis. So if Greeks are so ahead of people in France or Germany or the core countries of Europe, then that's a major problem, and that means that socialism's off the agenda everywhere in Europe. It's off the agenda in Athens because it's off the agenda in Paris. And especially in the world today, I think we need to be thinking about different forms of continental and transnational organization at every level, at the trade union level and also above that, as socialist as the organizational level.
Okay. Several people earlier drew the comparison between the shift from feudalism to capitalism and sort of held that up maybe as a possible model for the transition to socialism. I think that analogy is not well taken at all. And the reason why it's not well taken is that it's possible for one form of exploitation to develop within the bowels of another form of exploitation, which is exactly what happened. Capitalism developed within feudalism, and eventually it's area by area took state power. But it developed its power even within feudalism. You can't do that with socialism. And you cannot develop socialism within capitalism, because what you're talking about is you're talking about ending commodity production. You're talking about ending the subordination of human labor to the accumulation of capital, and that's what the capitalist state exists to protect and keep. Which is why socialism can only begin with the seizure of power. Then you have the possibility of this amazing transformation of society and the liberation of all of humanity. But that has to be the starting point, which is why I really didn't like Ben's initial presentation, which I thought was a concentration of pessimism and cynicism. Leninism, bad. Social democracy, bad. Anarchism, bad. And then there was just a dreamy hope that there would be this great mass movement someday that was going to change things. Well, look what happened in the Arab Spring across all these countries, where there were these great upsurges of people. And country by country, they've been turned around, and the whole system of exploitation and subordination to imperialism has been maintained. Why? Because there was not revolutionary parties at the center of those upsurges that could actually change things in a fundamental way. And this is why I think some credit should go to what Annie's been talking about and Avakian's whole project, because he's actually talking about practical politics. What would you actually have to do in order to transform the world? It has to begin with a movement for state power. That's what's meant by a movement for revolution. And if you're not thinking in those terms, and you're not thinking backwards from what you would have to do in order to do that, and that be the guiding lodestar for what you do today, you're really not talking about practical politics, and you're not talking about the real world. Finally, I want to end with one interesting announcement that I think you will all find interesting here. I'm from Revolution Books, and on April 15th, we and others are going to be sponsoring a debate between Ray Lata from the Revolutionary Communist Party and Slavoj Žižek on the subject of the past and the future of the communist project.
So, would you like to respond?
Yeah, sure. I don't know if anyone on this panel is going to defend Jim's capitalism, socialism, and Allen's feudalism, so maybe he can defend that.
in terms of my initial presentation being overly pessimistic, I mean, I'm a materialist. I think that recognizing material reality and the present state of the world and the present state of the left can never be pessimistic. I mean, recognizing the failures of the existing left is the first step towards transcending them. I'm talking about a revolutionary party. I mean, I do not think that the goal of the left at present should be to reflect revolutionary consciousness, nor should the goal of the left be to reflect consciousness of the workers as it is, but rather the goal for the left should be to assess the material reality as well as the consciousness of the people, and to know where contradictions may emerge, and to move in such a direction such that the people can be brought from their current consciousness to revolutionary consciousness. It's not going to come about by having revolutionary parties talking about revolutionary communism and just talking as if the revolution is around the corner. I mean, it's just not the case. We need to have a bit more of a recognition of present failings of the left and present realities if we're going to actually accomplish something.
Okay, I saw some hands. Can we get
To me. Okay, for the panelists, I guess I have 3 questions divided between them. For Ben, the questions seem, and these are all kind of at their most abstract, you know, since the left has existed, these are the major figures of thought that they move with. The question of movement, Occupy obviously raises that question of what a mass popular movement might look like, a class-based movement, however that would be determined, how that can eventually translate into the actual creation of transformation in society. For Bhaskar and Chris, my question would be centered around the state. And again, these terms might seem anachronistic, but the question of the relationship of democracy to the state. The old question, the old divisive question of the dictatorship of the proletariat, the question of dictatorship in general, whether radical transformation is actually able to be effected through what we recognize today as bourgeois democratic means. And third, for Annie, what I haven't heard in terms of the sort of end game of the state is whether or not what you quite enthusiastically referred to as seizing state power, does that include a sort of mechanism or redundancy by which the state would eventually wither away and decompose? Or is the state a sort of perpetual antagonistic mediator of class struggle, even in a society that supposedly would not have classes?
Okay, so let's go in the order that he asked them. Go ahead.
I'm not quite sure what the question was, Ross. I was thinking about occupying class-based movement, what that would look like.
How does movement translate into effective transformation?
I mean, I don't think that's something that you can say from this vantage point. I mean, the idea of how the present is going to translate into an effective transformation of our capitalist societies is like playing 10-dimensional chess, 10 moves ahead of time. I mean, really, what needs to be done at the present is to simply choose our first move. Our first moves of how do we move people in direction which makes that type of transformation more possible. And there's enormous effects of contingency on how things may develop, and I don't think you can really say, I mean, how you make sort of a broader socialist movement out of that. I mean, at present, we should be recognizing the weakness of the left and just trying to create anything that resembles a radical left or even a class-based left, and that's the first step. And I don't think that even talking necessarily, I mean, certainly in radical left groupings for sure, but I mean, in terms of our practical politics, I don't think necessarily even talking about immediate transformation of society is something that's going to appeal to the broad masses. I think what you need to have is a direct anti-capital movement and an anti-corporate movement, but not necessarily even specifically an anti-capitalist movement until we have a movement that can make the very idea not seem like a farce, which currently it is.
All right, unfortunately, you guys have been like collapsed into one person. You can both answer this question.
We'll do it at the same time. Well, I do think that the term dictatorship of the proletariat is really a contested one. I'm fine with the I'm fine with it as it's defined by like Marx when he's writing about the Paris Commune. I don't think that you could legislate socialism absolutely. Like I don't think that you could have a parliament that could vote for socialism. It's going to involve extra parliamentary action, people taking over their workforces, their factories, new forms of organization emerging from that. I do think there'll also be a representative portion of it, and that's probably where I differ from a lot of classical Leninists or people in Luxemburgist tradition. Yeah, I do think that fundamentally a future society, a society that is truly democratic, would be run in the interest of workers, and obviously will build in the meantime towards a majoritarian consensus towards that, because the working class is the majority of the population, but it'll obviously entail certain state apparatuses at some point that would sort of ensure that this new democratic consensus was secured from obviously the resistance by the old ruling class. I mean, I think that's pretty much just, it's very abstract in the present. My politics in the present isn't really aiming at how to seize state power tomorrow. I have been working at it, or trying to. But yeah, I do think that it's like intellectually there's nothing wrong with the concept of the dictatorship of the proletariat. It's not very good PR gloss, though. I think maybe we should I don't know, have some.
It's not New York Magazine stuff.
Nope.
I have fundamentally the same position on this question. So.
Okay, great.
I do have to say, look, this is where I'll answer the question that was posed to me, but I want to answer your question too. Look, because revolution is serious, and I actually do think it's a responsibility. When you think about, the people of the world, and yes, the oppressed people here, and the actual horrors that people live in, it's the project, I'm critiquing Bhaskar's last comment and the attitude. I actually just don't think it is, where I also think the snarkiness towards Avakian comes in. It's just all a joke. The world is all a joke, and world change is all a joke, and no, I wouldn't say this in New York Magazine. Look, if it matters, then you say it in whatever fucking platform you are given, because it's some shit that the world needs. That's just the truth. The world needs fundamental change. Now let's talk about how, and yes, there's a lot of joy in that, because you're talking about emancipation, but it also matters a great deal. And this is, the snarkiness and the jokes, it's an attitude that too many people take, and it's not real. It's just not what the people of the world need from us. So I just had to say that. The dictatorship of the proletariat is a very fucking good thing. And people need to understand what it meant in previous times, what it actually meant to real people who made revolution in terms of life expectancy, the role of women in those societies, and their actual participation in the running of those societies. It actually meant liberation, and that is, guess what it can mean again. And yes, the Constitution and Avakian and the RCP talk about, in terms of communism, yes, being the withering away of the state. And actually, there's discussion in this Constitution about how that has to be a real metric and point of struggle around which things get waged. Are we going far enough, fast enough? And yes, there is a contradiction in socialism for that state power to get pulled back to capitalism. That's what we saw in the Soviet Union and then in China. But yes, communism does mean, now it doesn't mean you'd still have some form of governance and some form of administration, but it wouldn't be the antagonistic division and the antagonistic role of a state, which is and contain within it the forcible repression. Because I guess that's what I'll say. I want to bracket a thing on democracy and revolution, and it's on the floor, but wasn't in the question. So.
Well, we have a couple more questions, maybe.
I'll squeeze it in.
Okay. In the back.
Where are you guys going?
We have to go make jokes.
Look, I think humor matters. It's just the snarkiness that isn't right.
That's for recording the microphone?
Yeah.
Okay, I'll be on tape. I did have a question, but I actually did appreciate the last thing she just said, reiterating that. I'm reading Marx's General, the biography of Frederick Engels. Does anybody in here know how many people read the Communist Manifesto when it was published? But a couple, less than 10. Serious. And those were people who were followers of Karl Marx in the International Working Men's Association, and people who actually, for whatever coincidences of their life, were part of changing the world. So I do think, and then also, so I told that example to someone else the other day, and they told me, and yeah, did you know there was only 11 people at Marx's funeral? So I think it's very serious that anytime anybody puts forward a platform of any kind that says, hey, this is how things are going, and this is how I think the world could go, anybody should really take that seriously and closely examine that. And especially when we're dealing with such a scourge upon planet Earth and humanity, when you're talking about the immiseration of billions of people over hundreds of years, the fact that people would just talk about dealing with, to use the analogy of a disease, that you would just talk about how to put a cold compress on the forehead or deal with the tumor without getting at the cancer. So that's my longer way of saying I agree, as someone who's been checking out Bob Avakian stuff, that people should look at it and follow it to their necessary conclusions, whether they agree, disagree, or discover things they didn't have thought about before. Which brings me to the problem with, I think, what you guys were saying in the middle here. You guys, you guys are bad scientists. A number of times you've said, no, I'm serious, I don't mean that as an insult, I mean that as a, take that in an intellectual sense. I don't mean that as like, hey, fuck you. I'm saying, a couple times you said you can't say things to people because they're not ready to hear it, essentially. It's sort of been the elephant in the room of most of the wagons here. Sure, we can have sort of a scholastic discussion divorced from actually changing the world and trying to make revolution, but you know what? People aren't really ready to hear anything, or people don't want to hear you talk about the dictatorship or any of these things. And so I thought you could maybe speak to that. I mean, you ended, for example, I mean, every time, I'm sorry, I don't remember your name, Ben? Yeah, and every time, again, I don't mean this as an insult, but I do mean it as to sharpen it up. You said, we all have to accept the failures of socialism, as I understand it, you were saying, or these projects in the 20th century. I actually don't think you should be doing that. People should look what's real, what was accomplished, what was done, and what, you see what I'm saying? Really examine things in the real world, and also understand what the difference is between failure and defeat. And I think, speaking of the American left, you know what's a real problem with the American left? Is positivism and that grand old thing of American pragmatism. Because something lost, therefore it's untrue, or something by virtue of being successful means that therefore it is true and right. And what I mean by that is, so a revolution was defeated in the past, must have been wrong. Okay. So those are my questions to those guys. Does that make sense? I hope it does.
Yeah, I mean, when I said that, I mean, so I wasn't trying to make the point that you want you not talk about revolution or socialism or post-capitalism or communism because the people aren't ready for it. It's about strategy. Is this an effective strategy to go around with the revolutionary communist party? Are people taking this seriously? Is this going to lead to the rebirth of the left? I mean, has it been successful since 2008?
People didn't take Marx seriously, and does that make it right or wrong? That was my point in that analogy.
People did take Marx seriously. I mean, the First International was pretty significant. But this idea that we need to focus on the correct program, and that once this grabs hold of the masses, I mean, there's a word for that. It's idealism. It does not belong in comparison to Marx, who was a dialectical materialist. If you want to have an actual left politics, it has to be not based upon program, but based upon assessing material conditions, assessing the conditions of the present, both the economic conditions as well as the consciousness of the people, assessing where the contradictions are, and figuring out how to speak to those people in a way that will bring them from their current consciousness to where you want them to be, not just repeating the consciousness of where you want them to be. So I think that's fun. I mean, so I write for the blog The North Star. Right? The name comes from the title of Peter Cameo's biography. He has an excellent article on this called "Return to Materialism," which you can check out, which will talk about how the disintegration of the left over the 20th century, or specifically the Trotskyist left, is to do with a reification of programs as a form of idealism. And we need to return to material reality, assess reality, and figure out how our program corresponds to reality, not vice versa.
Go ahead.
Well, I think that if you're making articulations for people to listen to, then it has to be grounded in their lived experiences and what they think and what they feel. And it's not a matter of just, I guess there's a Leninist term for this going to the extreme in this direction, like tailism. It's not a matter of that or movementism. It's a matter of actually just having your own thoughts and program and pushing people in a radical direction, but also just starting where people are, like, at least speaking a language that's accessible to them and that isn't completely foreign to them. And I do think that's one of the reasons for the left's marginalization is this over-fetishization of the early, and I would agree with you, the degree of a lack of respect and isolation of Marx for much of his life, and also the small size of the Bolsheviks and the fact that these were small sects and they actually took state power and changed the world, or in Marx's case, created a philosophy and guide to action that people change the world with. But I think these are sort of misleading examples. I think that, and the over-fetishization of these examples is sort of taking the left into very weird and isolating directions.
I guess the only thing I could say in addition to that is, most people are fully aware of their situation. Most people are fully aware of the fact that they are exploited on a daily basis. Most people are aware of the fact that the rules of the game are stacked against them, and that they benefit a very small group of people at the top. I can get that far with almost anyone I speak to, who I come across in my daily life, and if I start talking to them about things like the dictatorship of the proletariat, then I would be led out of the room. So I would prefer to kind of meet people where they're at, as opposed to meeting them with kind of these very esoteric ideas that mean nothing to them.
I'm sorry, I do have to take issue with that, because look, actually, most people think, or many people think, even if they have some sense that they're being fucked by something out there, they think it's human nature, they think it's God's fucking ordaining it, or they think it's their own damn fault. And thank you, Barack Obama, for shoving that shit back down their throats even further. That is actually what people broadly think. They think, I gotta get mine within this. They think they haven't prayed enough. They think, look, come out with us to fucking Brownsville or Harlem or anywhere across this country. Masses of people have all kinds of ideas. And yes, they do not need to be condescended to. They actually can come, just as we have here, to a scientific understanding, or not all of us, but just as people, I have to say, look, people can understand the way the world is, but they do need leadership that doesn't fucking condescend to them, that tells them shit the way it is and the way it can be, if they take a conscious role, an active role in becoming the backbone of that revolution. Look, the Revolutionary Communist Party and the movement for revolution is small, but it's not fucking marginalized. It is actually reaching out to the masses of people to build a movement to make a real revolution, and people should find out about this and work with it for real.
Well, to some degree, the people are actually smarter than the left, because if you look at the history of the revolutionary left in the 20th century and the disaster and just failure on its own terms and graveyards that it's left, then I would rather choose praying every night than going to the church of Baba Vakian.
It's not a church. Engage it. That's an anti-communist flip to get people to turn their thinking.
More questions, like. Okay. All right. Hannah,
You should take the key to democratic socialists like Cornel West who have some principled engagement. Seriously. Instead of dismiss things in
on that note, on principle.
Principal audience engagement too, please.
I guess, and I missed the first half of this event. I was not here. I wanted to just give my sort of impressionistic response to the comments made, and I wanted to ask something. One is that, Ben, we seem to be saying we, to some extent, live right now in a pre-political moment. There is a lot of work to do in order for, and you keep using the way of people to not think that the left is more than just a farce, Marxism, etc. So there seems to be you have this sort of attitude of a very long line of preparatory work that could lead at some point for a political goal. There seems to be some, I think, common ground in terms of thinking about where we are now and where we could be. And Bhaskar and Chris, you seem to be saying that, well, there is something that one can do in the present, but I think that it will accumulate, and the quantitative becoming qualitative sort of metaphor, that it would accumulate to then new conditions in which we could push for more radical demands, etc. And Annie, you seem to be saying that this is not leadership. Leadership actually means forcing the contradiction, forcing the conflict. It means sort of pushing things to their potential extreme, and not in a pejorative way. An extreme is sort of most palpable moment of change. I guess my question is, obviously all of these responses come from an assessment of the present, and my question is, how does your assessment of the present, whether it be in, sorry to mischaracterize if I have been, but in terms of a pre-political moment or sort of a moment that's not ready, how does your assessment of the present relate to you being a Marxist or on the left today? How does that relate to you considering yourself a leftist? And the second question, well, maybe this is just for Ben, but after your comments it made me think, that you keep saying the people, the people are not, the people will not take this seriously. What about the left? Are we just saying, is the panel sort of saying that we do have an idea of how transformation would happen, we do have a project in mind, but people are not ready yet? I mean, is the left ready? And what is the relationship between the conditions under which the left can operate and, that transformation? But I'm primarily interested in the first question.
Sure. We talk about a long round of preparatory work. I mean, I think there's a lot that has to be done, but that doesn't necessarily have to be confused with a long period of time. Things can happen quickly when the material conditions present themselves, as I think they have, and will be over the next several years. We talk about that work necessarily being pre-political, though, and I don't necessarily agree with that categorization. I think that type of work in consciousness of the people must be a political process. It must involve political interventions in both electoral politics and work-based politics, etc. I don't think that the left is going to solve its problems by talking about them, but by engaging with the masses. So is the left ready? No, I mean, of course it isn't. The left could only be ready when the people are ready. I don't think that the left has any clear sense of how it would transition beyond capitalism at present. I don't think it can have such a view until there is a mass movement.
I do think that, well, to answer your question, I don't think it's an amount of sort of a evolutionary socialism where you just, I guess, Luxembourg polemic about it was
Oh, I was just your metaphor, the quantitative.
Right. I was just referring to that that small changes over time can lead to something more substantive. And basically, I use the example of the Mitre plan, which failed for many ways, but I think if that had been successful, which it couldn't have within the framework of Swedish social democracy, but if it had been successful, then it would have meant a qualitatively different society. So it was in response to Jim's question, or someone's comment about socialist transformation from capitalism to something different. But I do think that the role of socialists, and I consider myself a Marxist, is to not only have a broader structural understanding of capitalism, but also to actually heighten contradictions and to push for more people to understand this structural critique, so they're not just looking to elect someone better or just looking for more wages, but actually has some sense of emancipatory possibilities beyond capitalism. And I think that is important, and I try to incorporate that into the work that I do and the activism that I do.
Yeah, for me, I guess my response would come down to two things. The first one is kind of similar to the point that Bhaskar just made, in the sense that there are sort of forces, trends, developments operating in our society currently that would be potentially liberatory if they could be harnessed for different ends, whether it's increasing amounts of productivity that could increase people's leisure time, but instead are used to put people out of work and deprive them of any kind of access to income and things like that. Those sorts of things could be fairly wonderful if they were brought under social control of one form or another. So that would be the first thing, kind of taking those things that are good, that are heading, I think, in a positive direction or could head in a positive direction, and make sure that that actually happens. And the second thing is that there's so much anger, deprivation, despair, need out there at the moment that I think needs to be dealt with. I think the left, labor, whatever, what have you, need to rebuild ideological and organizational capacities to alleviate those needs. That despair, that deprivation, improve people's lives materially and culturally, and to make sure that those energies aren't harnessed to reactionary and destructive purposes, because that's also entirely possible. I guess those would be the two main reasons why I would situate myself where I am today.
I think I'll answer, I do want to answer that, but I do have to say this bullshit about the Church of Baba Bacon and it's a cult, and it's just an anti-communist trope.
I didn't say that.
You said I'd rather pray to a god than pray to the Church of Baba Bacon.
Right, I didn't call it a
Quote,
cult. I never called it.
I know, but I'm categorizing it in the same category of which I call bullshit. Because these are
I wouldn't try to piss off cult members.
Look,
okay, come on.
Enough. These are anti-communist tropes to get you to turn your thinking off and to not engage the substance. And it's just look, it's bullshit, and people should not. And it's far too tolerated among people who consider themselves radical that they can just dismiss an entire 30 years of a body of work of somebody that's actually concentrating a really radical break with the way the world is, to just say, oh, cult, don't have to deal with that. Oh, church, it's bullshit. So that's my thing. Okay, on that. In terms of, look, I think you come on the question. I mean, it's not quite, the characterization is not quite right in terms of push to extremes. A revolutionary crisis comes out of the workings of the system itself. A revolutionary crisis is a situation where millions of people are questioning the legitimacy of the right of the rulers to rule, where the divisions amongst the rulers are sharp, and you see outlines of this now. And when there's a revolutionary people in their millions led by a vanguard party who are willing, or conscious and willing and determined to fight to break out of this. And then, like I mentioned, there is a doctrine for how a real revolution could be fought and won. Revcom.us, it's called On the Possibility of Revolution. And it's something people should seriously engage, who ever want to have the word revolution in their vocabulary and have it mean something. But look, I think you come to understand, for me, I think you come to understand, or I did, like, all the, yes, despair and deprivation that does exist in the world, you come to see that, and you actually come to see where that shit comes from, and that it does, and especially that it doesn't have to be this way, then there's nothing greater you could do with your life than fight to bring that into being. And this is, if you don't actually, and I said this before, but if you're not fighting to lead people to break out of this system, including the state power, which will, in your attempts to meet people's needs, forcibly intervene. If you're not trying to break out of that, you are piddling around and keeping the world as it is, and it's just too urgent to stay there. And we just have too much of a responsibility to the people of the world to stay there. So that's why I would, and I don't laugh, this is why I'm a revolutionary communist, and why I think people should engage the work of revolutionary communism, in particular in its highest concentration in the work that Avakian has developed.
Okay, so we're going to do closing remarks now. If you would have anything that you want to say, you want to respond to anything that anybody on the panel has said.
Yeah, I mean, I didn't really have closing remarks.
Oh, sorry.
Again, I would just stress that any politics at present has to be grounded in material reality, specifically the reality of the economic crisis of 2008, which features a vast overaccumulation of capital, which subsequently is proletarianizing more and more people and is intensifying the class-based politics. And so all activity for the left at present should be based upon intensifying these class-based movements. And where I think I did agree with a lot of what Vasco and Chris are saying, what I disagree with is that they don't seem ready to break with the party of capital, the Democratic Party. It's always pushed off further into the future to create this Labor Party or some other break from the Democrats, but it's never clearly stated. So, and just to bring that back to the point, I think, of this panel, which was supposed to be about the elections, I think leftists really need to start thinking about how to intervene electorally, but with third-party candidates who can present class-based politics that are not collaborating with capital.
Well, I'll just thank the organizers and thank you all for coming out, and the other panelists. And I do also I think that there was far more. I had far more agreement with Ben in particular than I let on. And yeah, that's it.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not letting you all off so easy. I was supposed to say, look, it's true that in terms of being grounded in the material reality, what does the material reality show us right now? That capitalism has historically developed and that it holds within it the potential to radically reorganize society, to get out from under the yoke of thousands of years of traditions, chains, in our physical being and the ways in which it has people locked mentally. There's a whole other way to organize society. That can be seen in the material reality that we're presented with, and the potential to seize power, to make revolution, to bring into being a radically different and actual liberatory society that can emancipate and transition to the emancipation once and for all. The emancipation of humanity once and for all. That is fucking possible, and if we aren't engaging that and dealing with that, we are sitting on a planet where millions of people are crushed in their body and their spirit, and our planet is burning. So I encourage people to actually seriously engage this, to get into it. Talk to me if you don't like the way the world is and want it to change. And I think I am now done.
So I would just like to say, if you enjoyed this panel and you want to find out more, if you haven't signed up on this, you should. Or you can also see a Platypus member that's here. So can you guys raise your hands, like Pam and Chris?
Oh, hey.
And Brian. You can see them. We have coffee breaks when?
Tuesdays at 6.
Tuesdays at 6, where?
I think on there. Everything's on the website, the New York
Check
one.
out the website.
Yeah, the New York has all of the events for New York.
Okay, and we're getting together. If you want to continue the conversation.
We're going to go get drinks.
Yeah, we're going to get drinks tonight. Now.
6th Avenue and 4th Street.
But
We'll all work together.
also, we should thank the panelists for that.